We will discuss the investment strategies adopted by different actors in order to determine if these strategies enhance the opportunities or the challenges outlined in the previous panel. Among the speakers on this panel are Dr. Gonzalo Paz, Dr. Daniel Cerqueira, Dr. David Atanasio, and Dr. Theodore Moran. Our moderator will be Ms. Alejandra Reyes, whom you already know. Dr. Paz is an adjunct professor at the Center of Latin American Studies. He is a pioneer in the studies of China and East Asian Latin American relations. Dr. Paz has also been an associated researcher at RAND, as well as a consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank and the Organizations of American States. Mr. Cerqueira is a senior program officer on the Due Process of Law and Law Foundation. He has worked on the Human Rights and Extractive Industries program of the Law Foundation team, conducting research, advocacy, and outreach activities on human rights violations related to extractive activities and the international responsibilities of nations involved in this industry. Mr. Atanasio is an associate in the International Arbitration Group. He focuses his practice on international arbitration and the matters of international litigation. He has an extensive experience in the energy, oil and gas, mining, and construction sectors. He has also acted as secretary for arbitral tribunals in arbitrations conducted under the EDF arbitration rules. Dr. Theodore Moran holds the Marcus Wallenberg Chair in International Business and Finance at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Dr. Moran conducts research at the intersection of international economics, business, foreign affairs, and public policy. He is the founder and current director of the Latinger Program in International Business Diplomacy. Please join me in welcoming our participants to the second panel.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to our panelists. We're going to start with Professor Moran.
Quiero representarme como un profesor bien culto, bien educado, y por eso hay que hablar español. Pero no quiero darle mal de cabeza. ¿Se dice mal de cabeza? So I, unfortunately, am going to shift immediately into English. I have written and done research on the resource curse and investments in Africa, in particular in Nigeria and Angola. But I haven't done any on-the-ground research there. In contrast, I have participated in the study of the mining sector in Peru. And I have, with Barbara Kochwar, authored a paper at the Peterson Institute for International Economics that will, I'm going to present some results, but those of you who want to follow up, I have given the citation to our organizers here so you can follow up. And in particular, we, because I had joint authors, compared Antamina, which is a mining company. The shareholders are BHP Billiton, which of course is Australian, UK, Glencore, which is Anglo-Swiss, Teck, which is Canadian, and Mitsubishi Corporation. These are the shareholders in Antamina, large copper, gold, primarily copper mine. And we compared it with the Shogun Group iron ore mining operation in Peru. And what we found was that, as you might guess, Antamina had a better record in terms of wages. It had fewer labor disputes and strikes. It had a good record on environmental practices, and whenever there were violations or spills or problems with the environment, they were remediated immediately without controversy. Shogun, the Chinese iron ore mining group, in contrast, paid at the lowest end of the mining spectrum in Peru. They had frequent labor disputes, and they had more environmental infractions, and oddly enough, when they started out, they would just pay the fine and go ahead with the infraction and then pay the fine. They wouldn't even remediate it. Well, what we found, though, because they started in the mid-1990s, what we found, though, was Shogang, over the course of coming into the modern period, their practices improved. In particular, as they were listed in the United States, in Canada, in the EU, and so they had reputational issues as well as stockholder, well, not so much stockholder, but SEC type concerns, so that they had a worse record, but they got better over time. Now, what I want to tell you about as the innovation was what we discovered with regard to Antamina. Those of you who know the Peruvian mining regulations will know that beginning in 2006, 50% of the royalties that a mining company pays went to the local province, municipality where the mine was located. And what happened was, you know, we tend to think of lack of transparency and corruption taking place, I mean, if you think of Nigeria or Angola, at the federal level. But what happened was that you started to see football stadiums popping up in the mining districts, named for the local mayor, constructed by relatives or political supporters of the local political establishment. So there was a lot of revenues that was going, and no traceability or accountability at the provincial or the municipal level. Antamina said, if we actually interviewed some of the strategists at Antamina, and what they said is, if we're going to pay these revenues, we want to make sure that they are well spent. So they brought in NGOs from the north, so to speak. I mean, Global Witness and Transparency International, and help to reinforce, capacity build the local NGOs and set up a foundation which would monitor the local expenditures. So that what you found was that actually in the region where Antamina is located, the medical facilities, working with the government, so that this is not something completely voluntary or corporate-led, but working with the government and with a foundation that, as I say, included these international NGOs, became actually an exemplar, a model for medical services, medical provision, and primary and secondary education. So this is recorded in the article. I'm now coming to a close. But so it seems to me what we did was we compared OECD, I mean Antamina, with a Chinese investor. We saw systematic differences. We did notice improvement in the Chinese behavior as they became more exposed to international supervision and international reporting. And then I thought that this particular helping to create NGOs who could be responsive and were trained, capacity building, to monitor expenditures, to look at accounting, to understand the local expenditure patterns, that this would be of particular interest to you. Thank you. Are you going to speak in Spanish?
I would speak in Portuguese if you would. Just to be close as you. Where is the presentation? Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank all those involved in the organization of this event. It's a pleasure for me. I assume I'm in charge of being a little bit more controversial than my friends here in the panel. I work for an NGO which is based here in DC, in DuPont Circle, and I have worked also at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for 8 years. So I will adapt my presentation to a very informal way because I'll basically use legal discourse. So I want to make it more feasible to understand and to stand. This is a movie, for those who are not old as me, to remember. It's Back to the Future. This fellow, McFly, he went back to the past, and then he started to take decisions that changed the course of the present. So what we're going to do in the next 10 minutes is basically go back to the past after dealing with the present, and then we move forward to the future. So here is the present of the discourse, the human rights discourse regarding investment, and how should we make companies and countries accountable for human rights violations committed under this context. This paragraph is a paragraph I have used in a publication in which I try to explain what's the international standards to deal with the obligations of home states of those companies that commit human rights violations abroad, mostly in Latin America. So this report was published in April 2014, and that's the title that I put. You couldn't do a worse job, Mr. Harper. Harper is the former Prime Minister of Canada, and during his mandate, Canada became a mining juggernaut, not only worldwide, but mostly in Latin America. Between 60 to 75% of all mining investment in Latin America is negotiated in Toronto. And he had a very aggressive foreign service to support mining companies. And some of them were violating human rights very clearly, worldwide and specifically in Latin America. So here I put some recommendations that this report submitted to the host states, which means states in which the projects are run, to the home state, in this case Canada, and also to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. April 2016, we sent a letter to Mr. Trudeau. He was already in office for 6 months, I think. And we said, Mr. Trudeau, you are a handsome guy. You have been doing a really good job on human rights issues in general. But in mining issues, you are not that different to Mr. Harper. So this letter was signed by, I would say, over 200 organizations, some of them grassroots organizations from Latin America, European organizations, the Catholic Agency for Cooperation in Germany, and here are the main aspects of the letter dealing with investments. The bold first paragraph is probably the fifth one is the ones I would like to raise the attention on how human rights has also a say when countries receive investments that could violate human rights obligations. So, you are still in the present. United Nations, you're not happy with home states. I can say that. As of October 2017, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has issued already 5 general comments and several specific comments with recommendations to states such as Switzerland, Germany, United States, Canada, and so forth. Calling the attention in the following way. If you want to invest, or if you have companies domiciled in your country, acting under your jurisdiction, investing abroad and committing human rights violations, you are not complying with your international human rights obligations. That is basically set forth in several instruments that we have ratified. The same thing regarding other special committees at the UN level. I don't want to spend time here. If someone has doubt, I can give more information on that. Now I'm going back to the past. 1948, the American states approved the OAS Charter, the Organization of American States Charter in Bogota, in Colombia, whose Article 36 says basically transnational companies, if you go to a country, you are obliged to follow this country's laws. In 1948, we didn't have the same, I would say, pace of globalization. And the way in which American states will deal with human rights violations committed by companies were basically follow the host state's law. That's 1948. I'd go back to past even before 1948. Evolutions of human rights obligations for dummies. That's the title of this slide. Human rights early in the 19th century was not even rights. They're basically underlying principles that give somehow reasons for the existence of a constitution. I don't know if you have think about how many fundamental rights does the original text of the United States Constitution have. Not only one. The Bill of Rights in the United States are all amendments. So the idea of a right that can be enforced by the judiciary branch is basically a 19th century idea. I would say second half of 19th century idea. Afterwards, we had also civil and political rights understood as fundamental freedoms that individuals should expect the states not to violate. And then socio-economic rights, duty to respect, protect, and ensure, which means the state should abstain from violating and also ensure that its agents will not violate human rights. And then in 1957, a German federal tribunal, I don't know if someone here speaks German, I'm not able to speak these things, I think it's something like this. It basically says that states should ensure that human rights violations are not committed among private actors, which means if I am discriminatory with some friend here, say, oh, you are gay or something, this person can bring a suit against me and the state should give a response. And that's basically the modern concept of human rights obligations. Private actors have somehow obligations in a sense that states can ensure and enforce its own laws to avoid violations committed by private actors. Okay. This idea of private actors being enforced to respect human rights changed the idea of jurisdiction. Traditionally, jurisdiction were very linked to the idea of territory. And in the Inter-American System of Human Rights in the 80s, the Commission approved 2 country reports saying, in the case of Chile, there is a roundabout in DuPont Circle in which you see a tag remembering the assassination of the former Chilean Minister of Foreign Affairs, committed by the intelligence in Chile along with some members of the CIA here in the United States. They blew up his car, and then the Commission said, you cannot kill people outside Chile. Chile is responsible for the assassination of this fellow and also a former minister who was assassinated in Buenos Aires. The same thing regarding Suriname, a lot of people from this country being subject to human rights violations in Netherlands, and then the Commission said, whatever you do against your citizens outside your country, it's up to you. Okay, move forward. You remember that we asked a lot of things to the Inter-American Commission in this report, and also we sent a letter to Mr. Trudeau, and that's the response of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Jorge Calderon already dealt with the judgments of the Inter-American Court, and that's the response that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights gave after the advocacy that we did along with several human rights organizations in the region. And there is one specifically that I want to read here. Abstain from unduly influencing the adoption of regulations or policies in host countries that favor investments by companies registered, domiciled, or with headquarters in the home state's jurisdiction to the detriment of human rights violations. So we did a sort of a brief of this report. You have outside this room several copies. The report has, I think, 150 pages. We converted that into 10 pages. So if you want to have at least, I see someone shaking the report. I'm glad to see that you have it. If you want to have an idea how the Commission for the first time dealt with home states obligations in the context of investments in private sector, it's a very interesting document. So just to wrap up. What's the future? I'll move back to the future. The company's paradise, corporate social responsibility, and self-regulatory standards take it over. No longer binding obligations, let's talk about self-regulatory standards. Human rights advocates paradise, binding treaty that's actually being negotiated this week in the Human Rights Council at the UN in Geneva. This binding treaty is adopted, and now countries and companies can be sued before international tribunals. I'll be straightforward with you guys. I don't see it happening in the next few decades, eventually centuries. There is no political support in the North, and it's quite hard to see it happening in the near future, I would say. My own take is a joke. 1985, when the movie was broadcasted, people thought that in 2015, we would have flying shoes. I think the most revolutionary invention in the 2015 was this selfie stick that people used to take pictures of himself. And I think Egyptians and Persians had a much more sophisticated invention at the time. I believe that the best way to think about the future is to see what was a mistake in the past. And for me, the huge mistake of the international community, when the basis of the international relations was decided in the San Francisco Charter, there was no voice at all raising the attention. What's the Hugo Boss responsibility for supplying garments and uniform to the Nazi Party? What's the responsibility of the Mercedes-Benz and Volkswagen for building tanks for a corrupt regime? And right now, we don't see that the same way as we didn't do in 1945. What's the responsibility of the banks who are acting as a money laundering for the regime of Venezuela, for instance? So as long as we keep committing the same mistakes in the present, we won't see a better future for human rights whatsoever. So thank you very much.
Now we're going to hear from Francisco.
Well, thank you very much for this very kind invitation, and congratulations to the organizers for this very professional job. I'm also honored to be part of this very distinguished panel. So after I have been asked to talk about the role of China and Latin America in the context of this theme, and I would like to start going back in history to 1492. So after this year, something happened that was unexpected by the people that were part of this process. We call it today in social sciences the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange. So this concept captures a process of many unintended consequences that happened because of the contact between Europe and Latin America, right? There were species of plants, of animals going to Europe, and from Europe going to Latin America. Several illnesses that were unknown in Europe appeared suddenly, and the same happened in Latin America, decimating the local populations. So I want to call this example, to ask you to remember this example, because a very important idea that was brought to international relations theory in recent years by contractivists is that contact, interaction, changes you. When you have this interaction, sharp interaction, intense interactions, you will be transformed into something different. And if there is an asymmetry in this interaction, you may imagine which side will have more effects of this transformation. And something similar, of course, in a totally different scale, but has been going on between China and Latin America since the beginning of this century. And the impacts, of course, are not evenly distributed in Latin America and the Caribbean. The second important point, I think, that we need to consider here is that in the last 15 years or so, we have been witnessing two very important macro processes going on in Latin America. One is this intense interaction between the region and China that was almost inexistent before in economic terms. And the second one is the so-called process of the turn to the left, the political process of the turn to the left. So the relationship between having progressive governments in many countries in Latin America and this, on the other hand, this process of intense economic cooperation with China and other Asian countries, but basically with China, I think that we need really a lot of research done on this area. This has been the two most important, probably, macro processes in the political and in the economic side in Latin America, and we don't understand really very well the interaction between both. We have all the periods in the history of Latin America of intense extractivism, but we are still needing a lot of reflection on what had happened in the last 15 years or so. On the side of China, we need to follow the 5-year economic plans. We are now in the 13th 5-year economic plan from 2016 to 2020. The China-Latin American Cooperation Plan approved in the first ministerial meeting in January of 2015 that put a goal for trade of $500 million. And these are very important documents to understand what is going on now, really very recently. I divide this intense period of interaction into sub-periods. From the beginning of the century to approximately 2008, 2009, the very focus of the economic interaction was trade. But since then, although trade keeps being very important, investment has become really, really the main actor. On the trade side, I must say that only five products explain 69% of the total exports of Latin America to China. So very concentrated in very few commodities. And these very few commodities are also really very concentrated on very few countries. So the impact is really very uneven. And also, from 2010 to 2015, 90% of the total Chinese investment has been in the extractivist sector. And so now we have a multiplicity of actors in the relationship. It's not only a relationship between countries or between, the embassies. There are many actors now in the relationship that are really very important. And so I think that China had a principal agent problem, that is to control, to put in the same page all these actors operating in Latin America. I think that this was one of the reasons for China to produce its first white paper on the relations with Latin America that was released in November of 2008, and the second white paper that was released in November of 2016, last year. This was very important to try to put everybody in the same page. Many things have been said about the mining sector and the oil sector. Let me focus and to mention a couple of comments on the agricultural sector. The agricultural sector has been really very important for countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, parts of Bolivia, and Uruguay. And basically, we are talking about soybeans. The production of soybeans have been really very, very important. Let me go back to my comment at the beginning of the Columbian Exchange. What was going on in huge parts of the southern cone, it had been a process of a transformed biogeophysical space. This was how I call it in a publication by the Woodrow Wilson Center in 2014. In other words, if you travel in central Argentina in, 1975, you will find an environment really very diverse with cows, horses, pigs, chicken, production of corn, of wheat, etc., you name it. It was really a bountiful land. If you are able to do this traveling now or last year, you will find soybeans, and a little bit more soybeans. We are talking about a transformed landscape, right? The place in which life is conducted have changed radically. So we are not talking about, something secondary happening or affecting the countries. We're talking about a process that really are changing the space in which life it's happening. And this conduct me to stress a point that I have made before. You can't study Latin America without analyzing the impact of China since the year 2000. You can't. So this transformation of the biogeophysical space has been really very important. It's very on a technological package. GM seeds that have allowed for the expansion of the agricultural frontier, but here a big problem happened. We are exporting water basically. In order to produce 1 kilo of soybeans, you need 2,200 liters of water. That is a lot of water. China, it's a country in which water is increasingly scarce. You need a package of agrochemical products, Roundup, for example. And then we have a problem because airplanes spreading agrochemical have created a big problems in many small towns and villages. So there have been a lot of regulations being produced by these small villages in order to try to control this activity by airplanes. And then you have, on the positive side probably, you have non-till and or direct sowing that have really benefit the protection of the soil. But on the other hand, you have a tendency to a monocrop, that is to have less diversity in the agricultural production. The sector is so advanced in the southern cone that, for example, in Argentina, the technological frontier vis-a-vis the United States, it's only 6 months. 6 months. So it's one of the most advanced agricultural sectors in the world. And it has produced a development of an industrial sector focused on the needs of the agricultural sector that is decentralized in many small towns in Argentina. And this is interesting to compare with the automobile industry that is really very concentrated around the city of Buenos Aires and basically produce roughly the same amount of jobs. So it's a very important new industrial sector have emerged. A main issue of discussion has been the issue of land grabbing. Land grabbing by Chinese companies, it's a process that is very well documented. It has been going on in different parts of Africa. So in Latin America, particularly in Brazil, in Argentina, there have been some regulations approved. In Brazil in the year 2010, in order to prevent land grabbing, and in Argentina in December of 2011. The limit in the best areas of Argentina, it's 1,000 hectares. In Brazil, it's 5,000 hectares. But basically, this is now a sector that is regulated. Land grabbing laws were not passed for China, at least in the text, but they have been passed because of Chinese companies' activities. So this has been a very important issue. I want to mention briefly, I have just 1 minute to finish, but the importance of this. We are not talking about something that is peripheral to our concern, to our interest about Latin America. This transformation of the countryside by agriculture in places like Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and now part of the analysis of the political, economic impact of China-Latin American relations. It's very, very important. The transformation in the landscape, in Argentina at least, it's crucial to understand the most important political crisis during the period of the Kirchner administration, the 12 years of the Kirchner administration from 2003 to 2012. The crisis was in 2008 because of the rising of the tax on the export on soybeans, call it the retenciones. They won't keep rising these taxes until there was, a major crisis in March of 2008. And this caused that in the following year, in the midterm elections of 2009, the Kirchners lost for first time an election in Argentina. This was the scale of the impact of the transformation and the lack of understanding by the authorities of it. I was, just to finish, mention this point. I think it is a very well-known statistic that the income flow of capital in Latin America coming from China in the year 2015, it was bigger than the amount supplied by the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank. So this is the amount of money that is coming in the form of investment or loans from China to Latin America. And so there is a high probability that the investment will continue in coming years. So this will be really an issue that we need to keep a focus on. And as I have mentioned, at least from 2010 to 2015, 90% of Chinese investment have been done in the extractive sector. So this is a crucial area to understand many of the countries we are following and interested in. Thank you so much.
I'm going to start off with a couple of questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. Both David and Daniel talk about some sort of regulations or laws that have been established, but also both of you talk about how there is a winner and a loser in terms of like bilateral investment treaties, either the company or the country wins, and in human rights laws, either the company or the communities are better off. Do you think that there is a way for there to be a middle ground in which there is not a winner or a loser in terms of the extractive industries in Latin America, from your unique perspective? Thank you.
Well, from my personal point of view, I think there are two ways of addressing if a game is a zero-sum or partial-sum. Either by the structural conditions for a corporation or the rationale underlying the actor's payoff. And not even neorealists, not even Kelhain would say that cooperation is unfeasible nowadays. There are a lot of things to be done in terms of how to reduce the cost of extractive industries in general, not only Latin America. And from my point of view, moving back to a legal perspective, there is no way of addressing conflict of, there is no way of addressing conflict of interest besides accommodating the interests of those actors involved. As Jorge Calderon said, development is a right in itself, but also there is a right of sanitation, right to life, right to physical integrity. The main challenge is to find a model of mining or extractive activities in which human rights does not pay the cost of the development of the general population. And the main way of doing that, for me, is still counting on obligations, not only self-regulatory models.
Can I add another dimension of the winner and loser question? I think it's very important to understand the issue of the unequal distribution of the impacts and of the benefits, right? For example, there are no people affected in Buenos Aires because of agrochemical contamination, right? But if you are living in one of these little villages and you hear, a plane crossing over you, and spraying the agrochemicals, this is really very serious. And of course, the earnings also are distributed in a very different way. This was one of the hot topics of the crisis of 2008 in Argentina, and it was, that all the income was retained at the federal level, but it was not distributed among the provinces that were producing this benefit with the soybean production. So this is a hot topic of discussion also inside the country, right? How the impact remain local, but the earnings are socialized or are, spent at the federal level.
Thank you. We're going to open up the floor for questions. There are 2 microphones, one over there and one on the other side. If you could line up and ask the questions, we'll take a few and then do another round. Could you introduce yourself as well,
Yeah.
please?
Hi, can you hear me? Hi, my name is Carlos. Thank you all for talking with us. My question for all 3 of you is, what can international organizations do to protect human rights in clandestine foreign investments, such as Russia or China investing in gold and diamond and oil exploitation in countries like Venezuela? We have a lot of international organizations to oversee the U.S. and Canadian investment in South America, but when it comes to China and Russia, I feel like there's investments and agreements being done with Venezuela, for example, where there's not that much oversee. So if there's anything that can be said on that.
Thank you. We're going to take the second question and then we're going to answer both.
My name's John Ettinger. I'm a master's student in the Latin American Studies program here in the School of Foreign Service. Thank you all for coming. My question is, with the current U.S. administration's kind of radical shift in approach to renegotiating NAFTA, to kind of pulling the U.S. back from a lot of international obligations and treaties, how do you see that affecting China's relationship with Latin America as far as kind of this global shifting of political and economic interests that's happening with what's going on in the U.S. right now?
Thank you. We're going to start with the first question about human rights being effective by clandestine foreign direct investment. Does anyone want to go first?
Well, it's a tricky question. When we decided to prepare this report regarding Canada, we focused on a mining giant in the continent because we were using the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which does not have jurisdiction to issue any decision regarding Russia or China, for instance. China and Russia are members of the UN, some UN treaties on human rights, and there are, I would say, very important movements to bring the attention of Chinese government for human rights violations committed under the context of its investment. International law, unfortunately, doesn't have, it does have some teeth, but it's mostly wiggly teeth. UN cannot bite a country, just like the Supreme Court here in the United States. Supreme Court can send troops even to the White House, and it has done during the Nixon's government. The UN, in theory, could send troops but under the authorization of Security Council, but China and Russia are members of the Security Council, so they would veto any attempt. International law rely mostly on public shame, and eventually Chinese can have a better democratic governance in the future, and some pronouncement by the UN bodies can have a better impact in China. But as I said, it's a good exercise to see the mistakes of the present to foresee what can happen in the future. I don't see the UN taking over some of the discussions that is taking place between advocates, human rights advocates, not advocates, but investment experts. I think the trend is basically lex mercatoria will be the law of the future to deal with investments and not human rights. That's my very pessimistic approach. But the challenge is to put our energy to avoid that, or at least to reduce the pace.
Well, let's go to the second question.
Gonzalo, do you want to answer the first question? Or?
No.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the second question regarding the new U.S. administration and their renegotiating of international regulations.
Well, yes, it's very important to know that still we don't have an assistant secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs, which is the highest authority in the Department of State dealing with Latin America. And we don't have also, a very clear policy of this current administration towards Latin America. It's very little what we can be said, on a firm ground. However, as it has been mentioned, the issue of the end of U.S. participation in the Paris Treaty dealing with climate change, it's very important in Latin America and in the Caribbean because we have seen this season, for example, huge impact of climate that can have in this country. So this is a very serious issue for the region. Mexico has been a country that suffered a lot of punishment, I would say, during the campaign for the presidency last year. And, now the administration have announced this renegotiation of NAFTA that, in my view, is not going really very well. And so you have the case of Mexico that has had so bad relations with China in the last 15 years or so. To give you an example, the trade deficit between Mexico and China has been around $60 or $65 billion every year. So the relations between Mexico and China have been really very bad. However, this year there was a BRICS summit in China in September, and guess who was invited by China to participate? Mexico. So United States punishing, in a way, Mexico, and the Chinese is trying to, repair the problems of the last 15 years. They are inviting them, they're treating Mexico really very well, right? So this is a kind of opportunity that has been opened in the current administration.
Thank you very much. We have another question over here. If you could introduce yourself.
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, actually, I'm too small. So my name is Janina Romero. I would like to ask a question, of course, more related to human rights. And then we try to discuss this also taking into account the grassroots movements, right? And one of the things that we have encountered with foreign investment is that sometimes the contracts are not fully disclosed to the people. So people are not fully aware what the government had signed, for example. So what can we do to, and that's the right to information, and it's definitely affecting the grassroots movements and the indigenous people and our Afro descendants. So what can we actually do to protect this right, the right to information, so we know what's going on, what the governments are signing? And also, another question that I would like to get an answer. I've noticed that recently Japan has been trying to have some involvements in the region. So this week, Prime Minister had a meeting with Macri, for example, and they're about to sign a number of treaties. So I would like to know, do you think Japan is trying to overshadow kind of China's influence in the United States? Can Japan be another important country in the region?
Thank you. We're going to take another question, and then we're going to answer all three.
Hi. Is it working? Okay. Hi, my name is Marcela Valiente. I'm from Mexico, and I have a question regarding investment. How new technologies are upgrading, or how they are affecting the investment in these countries, in these industries, and how they are gonna be sustainable, moving on some resources that the minority are using. For example, water. It's a resource that is lacking in the years next, and the minority is using a lot of water to do their activities. But how are the technologies gonna sustain that kind of use, and how it's gonna affect the investment, basically?
Thank you very much. We're going to start with the first question on grassroots movements. Daniel, do you want to take it?
Yeah, definitely information is a piece of the puzzle that's very important to deal with. I think that Joseph Nye's theory of soft power is a little bit flawed. There are a lot of actually piracy regarding Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemonic culture of hegemony. But he has a reason to say that some kind of power can be exercised through the domain of not only military or material capacity. And I can give you a specific example. I was in Mariana 2 months ago. It's where the worst environmental disaster from my country, Brazil, took place. And Samarco, the joint venture between BHP, Billiton, and Vale, submitted a report for obtaining the environmental license from Minas Gerais government, my hometown, saying that if there was a destruction of the dam, there would be a discharge of no more than 3.5 kilometers of mud. Turns out that the mud reached 850 kilometers until an island in the state of Bahia, 2 states distant from Mariana. Now the company is running a sort of foundation that's basically dealing with the reparation and indemnization for the victims. And I see the asymmetry of information playing a huge role for the favor of the company. I'm almost sure that the company will take the license back and will be effective eventually the next few months. And the information regarding the environmental impacts of this disaster, which is the worst of my country, is not being disclosed to the communities whatsoever. And we are now living a process of flexibilization of environmental license in my country, 2 years after the worst environmental disaster that we had. So part of the strategy should definitely be how can we make the disclosure of information much more effective? And there are some movements. Principle 10 initiative, there is an initiative called Extractive Transparency Initiative 80. A lot of grassroots organizations participate on this kind of, is a sort of roundtable movement because states and companies has also a table on that. But right now, the effects of those initiatives has been not very visible. I can tell from my own perspective because I was in Mariana to see what's the company doing right now in terms of keeping the information, negotiating with communities based on this asymmetry.
I'd like to address the second question, the one linking China and Japan. This is a very important question because Japan was the first country in Asia to engage with some intensity with Latin America in the 70s and in the 80s. There was, a moment in world affairs that Japan was considered to be the next strategic rival of the United States. There were a lot of concern even in this country about Japan buying, assets in companies. It was particularly after the end of the Soviet Union in 1981. And Japan has been engaged in the region for a long time. In fact, the Japanese scholars use a lot the idea of Latin America being the backyard of the United States. So a lot of this terminology passed to the studies of the relation between China and Latin America. So Japan precedes China in its economic engagement with Latin America, except some other historical important exceptions in the 16th century. But Japan now is competing with China, and I think that this is a very good thing, because if Japan wants to be back in the region, to become again a serious extra-regional actor in the region, it had to offer something better. And I think the Japanese always think in this way, that trying to offer an approach more focused on cooperation, on the development of human resources. So I will be really very interested to see what they are bringing to the region.
Thank you. We're missing one question. We haven't forgotten that answer, but let's hear one more, the last one, and then we can answer both at the same time.
Sure. My name is Thomas Seeger. I'm an alumnus of the SFS program. My question is for David. So the PDVSA is a company that has a lot of debt, as well as the government of Venezuela. And some of that debt is owed to contractors like Halliburton and a few others. My question is, if there's a default, how easy will it be for those companies to go after assets owned by Venezuela and its subsidiaries in the US and abroad? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just go back to the question regarding technologies and FDI and how that affects sustainability, and then we're going to go back to Thomas's question. David, do you want to say something?
I think it's very difficult to make, a meaningful channel comment on this. I think it's very specific. It depends, on progress in different sectors, in each sector. For example, in the agriculture, there have been Chinese companies buying companies that were preparing new seeds for the market. So they have been, buying soybeans. But now they are trying to grab a portion of this, of other sectors of the business, right? Not only buying, but trying to control the production, of this genetically modified seeds, etc. So definitely, I think the technology have an impact. But you need to look to every specific sector to really be able to assess the importance of this.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Now we're going to hear a few words by
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you all for coming today for this second panel. We still have a third panel later in the day, but this has been a fabulous panel, especially looking at the role of foreign investment. We started out with challenges and pitfalls. Later this afternoon, we'll be closing with thinking about a new model, what a new model of extractive industries and investment might look like. But I'm just delighted that we're able to have something like this here at Georgetown. Our graduate students, our undergraduate students have worked phenomenally well to bring in each of these speakers, to put on this whole day of events. I'm the director of the Center for Latin American Studies, and so I get to see one element of this, but we've really been stretching all across the university. We have business school students, public policy school students, undergraduates from throughout the campuses, and this kind of dialogue is what we hope to do best here at Georgetown. So thank you for your participation today. Thank you for all of you who have come. I hope you'll stick with us for the afternoon session, and before that, I hope you'll join us for lunch. So we have a tent set up. It's pretty amazing. A tent out by Copley, if I understand right. So we'll be going out there to have lunch right after this. But let's give one more round of applause to our great panelists.